Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio. So today, I'm going to be telling you all about the cards from Boundaries Crossed that we are going to miss in our standard format next year in the Pokemon trading card game. Now, for those that don't know, every year after the World Championships at the start of September, we see a rotation. And what that means is that certain sets that used to be legal for tournament play are no longer legal, and we are losing a whole bunch of sets, 5 plus a bunch of promos this time round. So what I'm going to do through this little series of videos is I'm going to go set by set looking at the cards, the significant cards we are going to be losing for every set that is rotated. Now, on the most recent episode 153 of my podcast PTCGRadio, I gave you my first impression of all the cards that we lost from rotation, but I made it quite clear that was not supposed to be a comprehensive list. I had not had time to sit down for hours researching it and really go through it. Well, now I have. So this is supposed to be your comprehensive list, and maybe I'll miss something or get something a little bit wrong. If that is the case, please feel free to pop it in the comments. Now, if you're thinking, well, hang on a second, Ross, aren't we having expanded format next year? The answer is, in a way, we are. Some regionals that has been announced are going to be in the expanded format, which instead of being the usual number of sets will actually bring in all the sets from black and white onwards, not just the X and Y sets onwards. If that's the case, then look at this video in a slightly different light. Don't think of it as what we're losing in standard format from Boundaries Crossed. Think of it as what we're gaining from Boundaries Crossed in the expanded format. And as a last little note before we get going, if you would like me to do a series of videos about the black and white sets, what we're gaining for expanded from each set which we lost a while ago, if you ask very nicely in the comments, I might just do so. So we're going to be splitting these cards into a series of groups, and the first group is, oh, you had such promise. Now, I'm only putting 3 cards in this group, but they are 3 cards which really looked like they were going to be good and never were. First up, we have Vileplume, and I remember a lot of people getting excited by this. It had an interesting ability, as Vileplume cards tend to do, called Allergy Panic. And it basically means that all weaknesses, both yours and your opponent's, are ×4. So you get a Pokemon that can do 20 for 1 energy, all of a sudden it can do 80 for 1 energy. It makes Pokemon ridiculously good. For instance, if you were to take a Donphan from Plasma Storm with a single fighting energy, it generally does 40 damage. Unless Vileplume's out and your opponent is weak, in which case it does 160 damage. Loads of people had the idea of making a toolbox deck with a whole bunch of fairly small Pokemon that attacked for little energy, like Donphan, that could essentially cover every weakness and hit for an absurd amount of damage very easily. Unfortunately, this never came to fruition. Now, this next one, some people might disagree with this, because Celebi EX did see a little bit of play, but not really. I mean, I played against it online quite a bit, but I don't think it ever really made its way into really competitive decks like that. It allowed you to use the attacks from your pre-evolution, so Emboar could use Pignite's attacks or Tepig's attacks, and there were some people that thought this could see a bit of play. One of the most popular ones, or one of the nicest ones I saw, were, for instance, using Gourgeist to copy Pumpkaboo's attack. So, for instance, you've got the more HP on Gourgeist while still using Pumpkaboo's attack in a Night March deck. It never really got particularly good, but it was an idea that a lot of people thought had legs. And the final card, which showed a load of promise but was never really good, is Crystal Wall, the A-Spec Trainer card, which, when it was attached to Black Kyurem EX, made its maximum HP 300. Now, there was a Black Kyurem EX in Boundaries Crossed, but it was never actually saw a huge amount of play. The Black Kyurem EX that everybody liked quite a bit more came out later in the Plasma Storm set, but even that, the vast majority of the time, people didn't use it with Crystal Wall, unfortunately. It wasn't the Pokemon tool du jour, if you will. So, a card which everyone went, whoa, 300 HP Kyurem, hang on a second. but it never really saw a huge amount of play. And I'm not saying nobody ever played it. There were people that played it, and there were a couple of tournament decks. But really, I don't think it was ever good like that. So now I want to look at some cards, and I've put these as You Used to Be Cool. These are cards which used to see play, sometimes in fairly large numbers, but in the last kind of year or so have really seen almost no play at all. And first up, we've got Blastoise. Now, you might want to argue with me here, because Blastoise was reprinted as a secret rare in Plasma Storm, and then was reprinted again in Plasma Blast. However, both those sets are also rotating, and he was first released in Boundaries Crossed, so I'm going to roll with him here. He allowed you to put down water energy as much as you wanted whenever you wanted, and he was really good with Keldeo, more on him later, and the aforementioned Black Kyurem EX from Plasma Storm. It was a very, very good card that for a very, very long time was the best deck in the format. But back then we had Tropical Beach, the stadium card, which basically it allowed you to draw until you had 7 cards in your hand, but then it forced you to end your turn, which was really bad if you wanted to attack. But if all you wanted to do was set up a Blastoise and get a huge amount of energy on the field, it became really, really good. And that's what Blastoise players used to do. Ever since Tropical Beach was rotated at the end of the last format, Blastoise has been pretty terrible. Although in Expanded, Tropical Beach is coming back, which means in Expanded, Blastoise, and you can hold me to this, ladies and gentlemen, in Expanded, Blastoise is coming back. I should just very quickly make mention that there was a chap who made top 16 at US Nationals using Blastoise with the supporters card Archie's Ace in the Hole. This was a supporter that you could play, and you could only play it if it was the only card in your hand, but you then got to draw 5 cards and put a water Pokemon on your bench as if it were a basic. And there was a chap who made top 16 with Blastoise Keldeo, but didn't play the whole Squirtle Rare Candy or Squirtle Wartortle Blastoise route, but instead just went Archie's Ace in the Hole for Blastoise and used Blastoise in that way to power up Keldeo. But we are talking very much one man as an anomaly, not an archetype that saw a huge amount of play. We should also quickly pay homage to the Squirtle with his fun little ability, which meant he was immune to being hit on the bench. We are going to miss your Shell Shield, Squirtle. Man, that's a bit of a tongue twister. Other cards that used to be cool, Altaria. And now Altaria actually came out in Dragons Exalted, but was reprinted as a secret rare in Boundaries Crossed. It did 20 more damage to the active Pokemon, if of course you were attacking with a dragon Pokemon. Now, just to be clear, this card was never really good for years. There was a very short period of time where Garchomp Altaria was a thing, and you could basically use that to do a whole bunch of damage. Now, that actual Garchomp was reprinted as recently as Legendary Treasures. It also appeared as a secret rare in Plasma Freeze, so it very much was in this format, although it took another couple of sets after Boundaries Crossed for the... Essentially, the Garchomp was rotated, but it was alright because we had it in Plasma Freeze and we had it in Legendary Treasures. Now, a friend of PTCGRadio, Bork Wisma, and I know I'm mispronouncing that, for which I apologise, he did make top 32 at the ECC a couple of years ago with this deck, but it was a deck that never lived up to its promise, and in the last couple of years, this Altaria has basically been completely irrelevant. Ironically, could be quite useful with the brand new Latios, with his attack which allows you to do 40 damage on the very first turn of the game, but that is of course irrelevant. Although, remember, in Expanded, we are going to have the new Latios EX, and we are going to have Altaria. So... yeah, I mean, you can only use one Wally to evolve up to, one Altaria on the first turn of the game, but you get 4 Altarias out, and all of a sudden you're not doing 40 for 1 energy, you are doing 120 for 1 energy. plus any other damage you can add with cards like Muscle Band. So, interesting, I think, to say the least. But that's expanded. As it stands at the moment, Altaria, you used to be cool, but you ain't no more. Another card that used to be cool is Flygon. He's got the ability that adds 10 damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon between turns. That means after your turn and after your opponent's turn. And you can, and we'll talk more about Dusknoir in a minute, but essentially Dusknoir allows you to rearrange all the damage on your opponent's side of the field, and you, for a little while, there was a Dusknoir deck with Flygon where you would play no energy and just let the damage build up turn after turn while you healed with cards like Max Potion. And if you're interested, I will put a link in the description to this video of a mirror match I played with J-Wits himself with this Flygon Dusknoir deck. But it hasn't been good for quite a while. And the last two cards that used to be cool, Aspertia City Gym, added 20 HP for all colourless Pokemon. It was really good back in the days where Tornadus EX was all over the place, but really hasn't been good for quite a while. Nowadays, the only colourless Pokemon we really use are cards like Rayquaza EX, and they would much rather have Skyfield in play than they would have Aspertia City Gym. And finally, Gold Potion, the ace spec that nobody played, then a load of people played, and then it went back to basically nobody playing it. It healed 90 damage with no downside other than the fact that you were using your only ace spec card. And it saw a little bit of play here and there. It was popular for a long time for a while I should say, in the Darkrai mirror match, because healing 90 damage essentially got rid of one of your opponent's attacks and was absolutely huge. But Darkrai is no longer good, and Gold Potion really disappeared before Darkrai disappeared. Always a card that had potential, but it, I would say, used to be cool. Now I'm going to go through some cards that I'm going to basically say saw occasional play. Some of these cards you may think I should have put in the you used to be cool or you had such promise sections, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going through all the cards you need to know about that you're either gaining for expanded or losing for standard format. So I don't think the labels are terribly important. First of all, Hue. Now Hue was a card that saw very much fringe play, but really started gaining a bit of traction, ironically, right at the end of his life at US Nationals in this Wailord deck. Each player draws or discards cards until he or she has 5 cards in his or her hand. You play that when you've got 2 cards and your opponent's got 8, you draw 3, they discard 3. That, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty gosh darn useful. It was played in the Wailord deck because Wailord basically tried to stall your opponent out by just healing with a giant 250 HP whale in the active, and what you would basically do is use Hue because your opponent, in an attempt to not deck out, would try and build a huge hand of cards and then shuffle them back into their deck using a card like N. Hue basically took away this option for them. But let me be very clear, ladies and gentlemen, Hue never saw that much play. Another card which did occasionally see some play, but not much, was Cresselia EX. Now, Cresselia EX is not a card that looks like an absolute powerhouse because, quite frankly, it isn't. But it's got that interesting ability that allows you to heal 10 damage between turns from Cresselia. And just like Flygon, that means 10 damage at the end of your turn and 10 damage at the end of your opponent's turn. And you could use this with cards like Reuniclus, where you put all the damage on Cresselia and then heal it off turn after turn. Or you could, for instance, use it in, say, a hit-and-run deck, where you would use a card like Donphan, for instance, do the damage, switch into a Cresselia, your opponent hits a Cresselia, but then you get to be healing the damage turn after turn after turn. It was a card which you either used to absorb hits, or you piled damage on and then healed off. It was basically a way to heal off a bunch of damage. But of course you had to use a hit and run card or something like Reuniclus in order to get the damage onto Cresselia in the first place. One which saw, I think, a little bit more play than that is Aldino. And I've seen a couple of articles online which haven't listed Aldino as a card which we're losing, and that's really sad. Aldino, you discard it from your hand, remove special conditions, heal 10 damage. It was really good in decks like Flareon, for instance, where you needed Pokemon in the discard pile, but it was also just a get-out-of-jail-free card. So there were decks like, for instance, Vileplume and Excelgor. Vileplume blocked trainers, Excelgor automatically paralysed, you had no way out of the paralysis. Except, of course, Aldino, and you would have to draw into the Aldino, but when you did, you could play Aldino, cure the paralysis, and have a turn of attacking. I think people are sleeping on Aldino, and that makes me a little bit sad, because Aldino's pretty gosh darn good. Couple other cards we're missing that saw occasional play. First of all, Ditto. And Ditto was a kind of card, and I don't think I was the only person here, who the first time I saw Ditto, I'm like, well, what's the point? And the point is, essentially, for surprise. So you put a Ditto down, and then you can turn it into any basic you like. More importantly, if Ditto's been down for one turn, then you can put your Pokemon down and then immediately evolve it into a stage 1, because that Ditto has been down a turn. So you put down a Ditto, and then you put down a Phanpy on the Ditto. Well, if the Ditto's been down a turn, it's as if the Phanpy has been down a turn, so you can then immediately evolve into Donphan. Or indeed, you can immediately go Squirtle, Rare Candy, Blastoise. And it was a way to kind of protect your basic Pokemon. If you don't want them to kill a Squirtle, you put 2 Ditto on the bench, and then whichever one doesn't get killed, you can go Squirtle, Rare Candy, Blastoise. It wasn't the kind of thing that people did a lot, but it was used occasionally. Now, we mentioned Dusknoir earlier, and I don't think we need to say too much more, but Dusknoir was the kind of card that people wouldn't play for ages and ages and ages, and then someone like Mia Violet would go and get top 8 at Worlds with it. It was used with something like Darkrai or anything where you'd spread damage. You didn't even need to spread damage, you could just do a whole bunch of damage. And essentially, you would use Dusknoir to move the damage around your opponent's side of the field as you like, in order to set up KOs. So something like Darkrai that did 90 to the active, 30 to the bench. Firstly, you could move around the damage to get KOs, but secondly, you could make sure your opponent had exactly 90 HP left, and then hit it with Darkrai, so that essentially you never overkilled a Pokemon. You could make sure your opponent always had exactly the right amount of damage on their active Pokemon. And what you could also do with Dusknoir, if your opponent wasn't playing any healing cards, of course, you could take prizes in the middle of a turn, or you could actually, so say for instance you needed an energy, you could take 2 prizes in the middle of your turn by moving the damage onto an EX and knocking it out to try and search for that energy. Or you could take all 6 prizes in one turn of the game, pile loads of damage around the field, don't kill anything, and then essentially knock out enough Pokemon by moving the damage around so that you knock out the active and then you've taken all 6 of your prizes. And that made you essentially immune to cards like N, which punished you the more prizes you took. And the last Pokemon, which I count as saw occasional play, is the wonderful Munna. Now, this was popular in decks like, for instance, Virizion Genesect. Virizion has the ability which means it is immune to special conditions, or all your grass Pokemon are, as long as they have a grass energy attached. So you would use long distance hypnosis. If you hit a heads, your opponent is asleep. If tails, who cares? Or people would use it in decks that played Caldeo and Floatstone. If you flip tails on long distance hypnosis and your Pokemon is put to sleep, you rush in with Caldeo, free retreat with Floatstone, and there's no real downside. It could also be used as a kind of Hail Mary in a kind of, I'm going to lose this turn if my opponent attacks. I know, I'll just see if I can put them to sleep with Munna. It's a fun little tech card that I personally am going to miss. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the top 5 cards that we are going to miss the most from Boundaries Crossed. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, there be arguments. All I ask is, if you disagree with my top 5, stick your top 5 down in the comments. So starting off at number 5, and I should mention that outside of number 1, and I don't think anyone's going to argue with number 1, the whole top 5, you could really rearrange the order here. But at number 5, we have Keldeo. Although saying that we're going to lose Keldeo from Boundaries Crossed it's a little bit of a lie, because it was reprinted twice, once as a promo in the tins, and once in Legendary Treasures, but both of those are also being rotated, so just like with Blastoise, we'll have a look at him now. Now, Keldeo was, as previously mentioned, for a while, part of, hands down, the best deck in the format, with Blastoise and with Tropical Beach. Because his attack, when you pile a whole bunch of water energy on him, it adds up really, really quickly. 50 damage, plus 20 for each water energy, with a minimum of 3 total energy on him, and that adds up very, very quickly. 3 water energy is 110, 4 is 130, 5 is 150, 6 is the magic 170, which is needed to KO most EXs, or at least most of the relevant EXs that were around at the time. Now this, for a while, was basically Keldeo's use, but Keldeo did get a bit better than that. He was actually used as, for his ability, Rush In, because of course Rush In, it kind of acted like a switch. Now with Plasma Freeze, we had the Floatstone card coming around, and that basically gave Keldeo free retreat. So you could Rush In with Keldeo, and then you could free retreat straight away, and that would basically allow you to have a switch whenever you wanted it, to get out of any special conditions or to change your active Pokemon. You rush in with Keldeo, you retreat and put whatever else you want active. Now it should be mentioned that as well as Floatstone, if you put a Dark Energy onto the Keldeo, then you could use Darkrai's ability, Dark Cloak, to free retreat, as when it had a Dark Energy attached, it had 0 retreat cost. But you could also do it with Fairy Garden, because as soon as you had a Fairy Energy on, you could use Fairy Garden to free retreat the Keldeo as well. So, and that came around in X and Y, that card. So it wasn't just Floatstone, you could use it for a whole range of Pokemon, a whole range of decks. I mean, Darkrai decks for a long time had one Keldeo in, and when decks like this Exalgor deck started locking the Keldeo in the active, some decks would even play 2 Keldeos, so that if one Keldeo got stuck in the active, the other Keldeo could rush in and free him. Keldeo has been seeing play recently in decks like this, and I think that for as long as it stayed in the format, it was going to see a little bit of play. At number 4, we see Town Map, a card which, when it was first released, looked a bit underwhelming, but it was one of those cards that was a sneaky one-off in a surprisingly large amount of decks. It allowed you to look at your prize cards. Now, it did have unintended consequences. I believe it was at the National Championships in the UK in 2014. I was playing the Diamond Minecart himself, Dan Middleton, and he was playing an Aromatisse deck, and I was playing Virizion Genesect, and I used Town Map, and I showed him that my G-Booster was prized. And that meant I couldn't get any big one-hit KOs, so he piled a whole bunch of energy on a Mewtwo and knew that I couldn't one-hit KO because I couldn't get my G-Booster. Excellent play from him, and it really backfired. So it did give your opponent some information, but there were decks when you really needed to know what your prizes were. You really needed a specific card to not be prized. Town Map really helped you. It was played in Virizion Genesect to get that G-Booster card. More on that deck when I show you my What We Lose from Plasma Blast video in a few days' time. But also decks that really needed double colourless energy. Or indeed you could use it in these Dusk Noir decks, because I've already mentioned you could take prizes in the middle of a turn. You could choose which prize you took. At number 3, and 2 and 3, I really did agonise over the order, but I'm absolutely convinced these are the top 3 cards in the set. Number 3, Skylar. A weirdly underpowered supporter which saw a lot of play in a huge amount of different decks. And it saw play in so many different decks, it had to make the top 3. Search for a trainer card. Now, we all had those turns where we would use Skylar to search for a better supporter to use the following turn, but there were decks, again, Virizion Genesect would use this to search for their G-Booster to make sure that they could get the big KO. Or we'd use it to search for a computer search to go for a double colourless energy. And decks that really relied on double colourless energy, it was very common to see them go Skylar for a computer search for a double colourless energy. It's all playing a lot of decks. The second, and I think this has got to be number 2 given where we are with the list, Landorus EX. It's always been good, it's always seen play, and since the advent of cards like Fighting Energy and Strong Energy and Fighting Stadium and Muscle Band, we have just seen these decks go crazy. You know, Landorus can now hit 90 damage plus 30 to the bench for a single Strong Energy, which is quite frankly ludicrous. But don't sleep on its second attack, which does a minimum of 150, and with Muscle Band, Strong Energy, Fighting Stadium, it's likely to do more. A very good, very efficient Pokemon. The kind of Pokemon that forced people to put Mr. Mime in their deck because it was so efficient at hitting bench damage as well. And there have been times when, for instance, Landorus Bats was the best deck in the format. And that brings us to the number 1 card in Boundaries Crossed, and in fact, the card we're most thankful to have back in Expanded, or the card we're most likely to miss in Standard, depending in which format you're playing, Computer Search. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this card, as soon as it was released, the price rocketed, and everybody put one in their deck. The general rule of deck building ever since Boundaries Crossed came out was you put one Computer Search in your deck unless you really need one of the other ace specs. Now, as a side note, all of the ace specs are rotating. In Standard format, ace specs are no more. But Computer Search was always the ace spec of choice. There would be some decks that really needed a 5th max potion or whatever, so they play Dowsing Machine. I've already mentioned that some Darkrai decks would choose to play Gold Potion, etc. But the vast majority of decks ever since it was released played Computer Search, and that makes it not only the most valuable card in Boundaries Crossed, but one of the most valuable cards we've ever seen in the Pokemon trading card game. It really was that big. Most decks played it for the entire duration of its eligibility for tournament play, and although I am completely fine with you arguing anything else in my top 5 cards that we're going to miss from Boundaries Crossed, I really don't think you can argue against Computer Search being the card we are going to miss the most. Now it's that time of the video, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you click that like button. Go on, it will take you a second. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do. If you have, get a friend to subscribe and argue in the comments. Do you agree with my top 5? Do you think I've missed any cards? Do you think I've brought up some cards that you wouldn't have put on your list? And of course, as well as doing these videos that I'm doing for cards we're going to miss from sets that are rotated in Standard, would you like to see a series of videos on cards that we are gaining with the black and white sets, cards that we may have forgotten about? And of course, go check out Wassy Plays. It's my video game channel. It's just like this but for video games. I have a sneaking suspicion that if you try it, you'll like it. Just like Pretzel M&Ms. Although I should mention I'm not sponsored by Pretzel M&Ms. But if anyone in the US wants to send me some Pretzel M&Ms,